the challenges that we've run into while trying to use logical definitions or patterns in ontology development, and hopefully the solution that we think will take care of a lot of the challenges. So the first thing is sort of, what is a challenge? Well, we're trying to bring together phenotype ontologies that have essentially been developed in silos and for very specific purposes. And we need to then unify these while still supporting the individual use cases that the ontologies were developed for. And so how did we get here? Well, we've had a whole bunch of different model organism databases that have developed these ontologies for answering very specific needs of either their community or a few communities, and have developed their own idea of, well, what does the word phenotype actually mean? Not everybody uses it in the same way. And as we've, over the years, tried to bring these together, we've started to use what are called logical definitions, and I'll get into that. And we've iterated the development of these. So there's been a lot of iteration and a lot of trying to come together and trying to come up with a unified approach. And so logical definitions were sort of the first attempt to say, well, right, we're still going to use our ontology. We're still going to use our terms and our definitions, but we'll use equivalence axioms or logical definitions to break these terms down into their constituent parts and pull those parts from other ontologies. And that way, by that, we can build a bridge where you can say, all right, when I'm talking about a heart valve in the mammalian phenotype ontology, that's really the same thing as when they're talking about that in the human phenotype ontology. But what we've sort of come to realize over the years is that because the logical definitions, even the simple ones, have a lot of parts. So if we take just the abnormal heart valve morphology term, we have a BFO term for saying this phenotype has some part. And then we have terms that we pulled out of PATO to say that it's related to morphology and that the morphology is abnormal. And then we've pulled terms from the relationship ontology to say that this morphology inheres in something and it has this modifier, which is abnormal. And then we've pulled terms from UBERON or the mouse anatomy or the human anatomy or zebrafish anatomy or the GO or any number of other places to say what's the actual entity. And so what we have are a lot of moving parts and a lot of places where, as you're building this, you can get inconsistencies and variability where you might be defining the same thing, but you're not defining that thing in the same way. And so what we found is there are two major challenges. One is maintaining the definition. So if a change is made to an underlying ontology, if a change is made to the way the definition is built, to the way we want to structure our logical definitions, you then have to go back and fix everything that was made using that, and invariably you miss some. And then the other problem is, because there are a lot of moving parts and there are a lot of underlying ontologies that you can pull from, well, you can end up with both inter-ontology and inter-curator, and honestly, intra-ontology inconsistencies in creating the definitions. And to give you a couple examples of maintenance issues, so as we have iterated into the development of these logical definitions, at one point we felt that it was important to say, all right, if X is not present, like if you have no kidney, you wanted to say, well, all right, I'm absent kidney, and that inheres in some multicellular organism. And then over the years, we decided, well, no, we don't really need to say that. You can just say the kidney is absent. But that meant we had to go back and find every case where we had used this old pattern and change it to the new pattern. And I can say with confidence, we still haven't found them all. There's, over 10,000 terms in the MP. There's over 10,000 terms in the HPO. It takes a long time to try to fix every instance where you've used a particular pattern. And then as we've worked through this process, we've also run into issues with inconsistency in building these definitions. So when you're building the logical definitions, you have to pick what ontology you want to use for each part, and then you have to pick how you want to build the definition. And even if, as I think most of us do, you go look at the existing definitions to see, all right, well, can I just copy this one and substitute in what I want? Unless everything is perfectly consistent in the ontology to start with, you're going to invariably end up with some people picking one style and some people picking the other style. And so in this particular case, where we have terms describing cysts in an anatomical organ, so like a kidney cyst or a liver cyst, we had one style definition which used a term cystic from the pathology empath ontology and had this sort of formation. And then we had another style which said increased amount and used cyst from PATO. So we are describing exactly the same phenotype with two very different logical definitions. And hopefully the anatomical entity that people picked was the same if they were talking about the same entity, but you weren't going to get that both of these were talking about a cyst in that, because there's no connection between empath and PATO. And in this case, both the MP and the HPO were both using both of these styles. So what we've hoped to do now, I will hand over to Nicole to share and talk about how we think we can fix these by using shared patterns.
Right, thanks, Sue. Yeah, so the solution that we came up with was this shared pattern kind of strategy where we implemented these shared patterns across all the different ontologies that we were trying to align. And I'll tell you about how this works and how we feel like this solution helps us address the issues that we had with maintaining consistency between and within the ontologies, and then just the overall maintenance of the ontologies. So the shared patterns that we used are called dead simple ontology design patterns, or DOSDPs. These were initially created by David Sutherland, and they've been widely adopted amongst the many of the OBO foundry ontologies and within our group of phenotype ontologies. So as part of this effort too, we created this unified phenotype ontology called uPheno, and that's available at this GitHub repository link here below. So as part of this uPheno effort, we came together as a group of ontology developers from the different phenotype ontologies for like human and mammalian, and we had zebrafish and xenopus and C. elegans and many others. And we came together to try to develop these standardized patterns, which I'll give you more details about, and then come to an agreement on how some of these terms that generally applied across the different phenotype ontologies, how these should be represented. And then we would develop a repository and shared all these patterns, and they're freely available in our uPheno GitHub repository. So, so there's some of the key features of the DOSDP, the design patterns that we're using, is that they specify, they're in a YAML format, and they specify a defined set of ontology classes that are used in the terms, and then also define the relationships that are used, that are intended to use in the logical definitions. And then we have these variables where we can just kind of insert the variable as needed to apply to the particular class that we need. So an example of a generic version of a pattern is like the example Sue gave with using cystic. So if we had a cystic anatomical entity, all we would do, the anatomical entity would be the variable, and we would just insert whatever anatomical entity we needed there, like if you had a cystic kidney or a cystic pituitary gland. And then we have these defined logical definitions. So then all the ontologies that have cystic anatomical entities would use the same type of equivalence definition. So we also have additional code in the YAML file that allows for the automatic generation of the term name. So we can have like a defined term that would be like cystic anatomical entity. We can also specify the synonyms, and they could be exact, broad, narrow, etc., just like usual. And also we can specify the text definitions that are generated using these patterns as well. So this is an example of what the YAML code actually looks like. So it's very, you can see it's very simple to use, very simple to generate these. So let's take you through this a little bit. So we have a pattern name that defines what the patterns are called. And then we have descriptions that help the curators like ourselves understand what the purpose of these patterns are and when to use them. We collected information about each contributor that has contributed to one of these patterns. And then we have the defined classes and relations. And these are the non-variable classes. And then we have the variable classes. So in this case, we can use any child of anatomical entity from UBERON can be filled into this pattern. And then we use a simple spreadsheet format along with robot to automatically generate these terms, or we can automatically generate these terms, or we can automatically retrofit existing terms to conform to this pattern. So for example, with this cyst and location pattern, this pattern would create a term called pituitary gland cyst, which is an existing term in HPO. So this pattern has been applied to this HPO term, and then it would generate this definition. And these can always be overridden too. So this is just, if you initially want to create some terms, this is a fast and simple way to do this, because you can just create a spreadsheet with a list of all the variables, and then it'll automatically generate these, or we can also apply these to existing terms. And like I showed you before, this is the YAML code that would generate this logical definition. So the patterns, so as a team of phenotype ontologists working together, this is how some of the workflow of how we work together to do this. So we initially reviewed all of the existing kinds of classes and types of classes that we had in our ontologies, and we identified terms that we could apply these shared patterns to. So things like abnormal morphology or abnormal anatomical entity in a location, things like that. We came up with over 200 patterns actually, and we iteratively worked together to determine what kinds of groups of phenotypes could we apply patterns to, and then we developed these patterns in these YAML formats and put them on our issue tracker. And then we have biweekly meetings where we meet, and we iterated over these for many months, and we all worked together to try to iterate over them and ensure we agreed upon how certain things should be represented in these logical formats. And then once we had agreed on a final pattern, we entered it into the repository, and these are all available for anyone to use. And we also went through and applied a lot of these patterns to the existing terms in our ontologies to ensure that they were consistent. So yeah, now this pattern kind of workflow is now incorporated into our ontology build process. So as our ontologies are, as we add new terms, we ensure that we use these patterns to apply these logical definitions consistently across the terms. We can use these to apply the logical definitions. This has been really valuable, like Sue mentioned. It wasn't just issues with interoperability, but even within our own ontologies. I primarily work on the HPO, and even within HPO, we had a lot of inconsistency between even cystic terms, like the example that we gave. So it's been really helpful to be able to go back through our own ontologies and ensure that everything is now represented consistently, and also in between our ontologies. And yeah, so when we create new terms, we can use these patterns to help define the classes and make sure that they're being added consistently in our ontologies and between our ontologies. And then this uPheno ontology is its own entity in itself that is built by using the structure of these patterns to generate terms, and it includes all the terms from our different phenotype ontologies. So it's a unified phenotype ontology, much in a similar way as UBERON was developed. So this has been really valuable for us in our group to start using these patterns. And like I said, it's allowed for consistency. It's reduced a lot of the inter and intra ontology and intra-curator variation between the ontologies and within our ontologies. Now we're able to define the classes and variables and have less inconsistency in between our projects. And like Sue said, with the challenges of having to go through, if we change the pattern, now we don't have to manually go through and maintain the ontologies. We can apply these workflows to automatically update the, if we want to change a term, we can automatically change the terms of this Swift workflow that works a lot nicer, works very nicely. So some additional benefits to this project that we've been working on, we found that during the process of trying to develop the patterns for our ontology, for our different phenotype ontologies, we identified a lot of underlying issues with the ontologies that we import for usage. So like we found a lot of new issues in PATO and UBERON that we've worked together as a team to try to address those, and that's been very beneficial. And yeah, so and once we started applying these patterns and doing some of the inferencing and reasoning in the ontology, we also were able to identify new problems with some of the logic, and that's helped us identify underlying problems and correct those as well. So it's been very beneficial for us. It's been a very positive project, and we will continue to be using these patterns going forward. And like I said, we've created over 200 patterns for phenotype ontologies, and they're freely available and free to use in our pattern directory on our GitHub repository. So yes, there were several different databases and ontologies that participated in this project, and they are listed here. And also we've had several folks participating who are listed here. This effort was led by Nicole, who really coordinated the community and brought us all together and helped us all implement all the technical considerations with applying these to our ontologies. And we continue to have bi-weekly meetings on the second and fourth Thursday every month, and those are open to everybody. So if anybody's interested in learning more about that, and we also have a Slack workspace if anybody wants to join the Slack and join the conversation. And thank you for listening.
Thanks so much. We're already out of time, but let me take one question from the chat. Hyundai asked, great talk, Sue and Nicole. It looks like these are great tools geared toward ontology enthusiasts like ourselves. Do you have any tools for curators that are just starting out or don't have the time to put in for new terms and patterns? Time to put in for new terms and patterns. Let me ask a corollary question. What is the learning curve here?
I feel like the learning curve it's a bit to actually implement the patterns is a bit technical, and Nico helped all of us individually a lot with that. So I feel like as a new curator, it might be a little bit challenging just to sort of take this out of the box and start using it. Actually, just writing the patterns is quite simple because of the really simple format that David developed. So, and then like Sue said, when when you're creating new definitions, you just find an example and fill in the copy and paste the changes. And that's kind of how I think a lot of us approach the development of the patterns. So I think parts of it are pretty simple and straightforward, and parts of it are a bit technical and would probably need some assistance.
Right. But just to add to that, Nicole, these do work with the ODK system for actually building new ontologies. And so if somebody is really new, wants to build a new ontology, now instead of trying to figure this all out, they just have to go look and say, here's the kind of terms I want, here are the patterns I want to use, here's the anatomical things I want to reference. I'm going to put these in a spreadsheet. I don't have to learn how to use Protégé. I don't have to learn how to use all these other tools to build. I can actually pretty quickly kick off a basic ontology for my species and then build up from there. And I will second Nicole's. Nico is our most valuable tool.
Yeah.
This